My atheist boyfriend has banned my faith, but he has no idea what a priest who used to sell weapons can do. I have this vivid memory of my grandmother, dressed in her simple cotton dress with tiny printed flowers, leaning over a small wooden table adorned with pictures, rosaries, and flickering candles. She always called it her altar, though it was different from the grand altars you might see in elaborate cathedrals or large religious displays. Hers was small and humble, tucked into a corner of her modest living room. I remember sitting on the floor watching the light from those dancing flames glow in her calm, caring eyes. Even as a child, I sensed there was something quietly sacred in that moment, a gentle space between the ordinary and the unseen. Years later, when I moved into my own apartment, I assembled a similar altar. It was roughly the size of a bedside table, with a single drawer. At first, it held only one candle, along with a photo of my grandmother and a small note she'd once written. Over time, I added keepsakes that felt meaningful, images of saints I had grown fond of, tiny statues, a couple of prayer cards, and small tokens from my travels. It never felt like a rigidly religious practice. More so, it was a place of memory, homage, and personal reflection. My grandmother had taught me that there is value in honoring our ancestors, in pausing to acknowledge the deeper threads of life, and in protecting a space dedicated to gratitude and reflection. I never labeled myself as particularly religious. I wasn't raised in a strictly devout household, but the presence of spirituality had always been there in the background. My grandmother embodied a warm, inclusive kind of faith, never pressuring others or judging them for different beliefs. I took after her in that sense, seeing spirituality as an intimate conversation with one's roots and personal experiences rather than a strict adherence to dogma. In my own romantic relationships, my altar was never truly an obstacle. Sure, partners or dates would glance at it, sometimes curiously, sometimes indifferent. An ex once asked if I prayed every day, and I'd told him no, not exactly. Sometimes I lit candles or placed fresh flowers there. Other times I simply passed by and felt comforted. There wasn't any big ceremony or demand that others join me. For me, it was a private act of remembrance. Then I met Tommy. We first crossed paths at a mutual friend's birthday gathering, one of those rooftop get-togethers where the music thumps in the background, drinks flow freely, and people chat under strands of twinkling lights. Tommy was standing by the railing, looking out at the city skyline with a slight smile on his face. I joined him, and we started talking about nothing in particular, the conversation sliding comfortably from how we knew the host, to what brought us to the city, to the things that made us laugh. We clicked almost instantly. Over the following weeks, we went on a string of spontaneous dates, nights wandering through the local art district, afternoons in coffee shops discussing random pieces of trivia, lazy evenings on my couch or his. He was a graduate student in computer science, perpetually juggling research papers and code. I was working as a freelance illustrator and designer, so our schedules were flexible enough to allow frequent meetups. I quickly discovered that he had a wide, earnest smile, a quirky sense of humor, and a gentle way of asking questions that made me feel at ease. Even when we disagreed on politics, on movies, on whether pineapple belonged on pizza, he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. At first, I only casually mentioned my altar. Tommy hardly reacted beyond mild curiosity, nodding and letting me continue. I assumed he didn't mind. He identified as an atheist, but I'd dated atheists before and never had a problem. Often, atheists I've known simply didn't care if someone prayed or lit candles in private. Tommy, it seemed, was no different. Sometimes, if he arrived at my apartment and I was in the midst of lighting a candle or tidying up the altar, he'd glance over with a curious expression but never voice disapproval. We approached our one-year anniversary smoothly, in a blissful flow of shared brunches, Netflix marathons, introductions to each other's friends, and the occasional silly argument that we'd patch up with kisses and apologies. Around that milestone, Tommy suggested we consider moving in together once our respective leases were up. We practically live at each other's places anyway, he reasoned, glancing around my apartment. It'll save us both some money and let us wake up together every day. I was thrilled at the idea, picturing a cozy shared space, a real merging of our lives. Little did I know that the altar, a small and unassuming piece of furniture to me, would become a lightning rod of tension. A few nights after Tommy proposed we move in together, we were sitting in my living room discussing potential neighborhoods. He was leaning forward, scanning listings on his laptop, while I was standing by the altar, tidying some of the items. Without looking up, he asked, "So what about this table thing? Are you going to bring it with you when we move in?" "It's my altar," I said gently, smiling. "Of course I'm bringing it. I bring it everywhere I go. It's not exactly large, it shouldn't be hard to fit in." He paused, his lips pressing together. "Yeah, but I'm not sure I want religious stuff in our home," he said, voice low, carefully measured. "I don't believe in any of that. It feels weird to have it around." I turned, startled. "But you've seen it here all these months. Does it bother you now all of a sudden?" "It's just," He exhaled. I didn't think about it before, but if we live together, then it's our space. I'd like to keep it free of religious image. You know I'm an atheist. A hot flush of confusion and anxiety went through me. Tommy, you've always been an atheist. I never took issue with that. And I'm not inviting you to some formal worship or anything. This is just my personal space, my way of remembering my grandmother and connecting with my heritage. He set his laptop aside, looking genuinely uncomfortable. I know, I don't want to come home and see candles and saints or whatever. It's just not my thing. It feels like I'd be disrespecting my own beliefs if I allowed that in my home. Something about that phrasing, disrespecting his beliefs by allowing me my practice, triggered a defensive knot in my chest. Disrespecting your beliefs? I repeated carefully. You don't have to believe in it, but can't you respect that it's important to me? I'm not forcing anything on you. Tommy shrugged. I'm sorry, I just think religion is silly, and I don't want it around. It's like you're putting religion ahead of us. That was a knife twist. I'm not putting religion ahead of you, I said quietly, trying not to show how hurt I was. This is a deeply personal thing. It's part of who I am. It's how I honor my grandmother, my ancestors, and my heritage. It has nothing to do with me trying to convert you or anything like that. But he remained adamant, going on about how he wanted a strictly secular home, how it made him uneasy to see religious objects. I suggested we keep it in a separate room, maybe the bedroom, or a small corner that wouldn't be on display. He still refused. We circled the topic for half an hour until we were both worn out and upset. Eventually, he left, giving me a resigned shrug and a kiss on the cheek that felt perfunctory. I stood there afterward, staring at the altar, wondering how something so small and quiet could loom so large in our relationship. I tried to imagine giving it up for him, stowing it in a box or discarding it altogether. The thought of that made me feel hollow. My grandmother had always said that an altar is a place where you bring what matters to your spirit, and in giving up the altar, I would be giving up that connection. I realized I couldn't do it. Then the question became, would Tommy make me choose? I posted about the issue on Reddit, seeking advice. The responses were overwhelming in volume and emotion. Some told me to leave him immediately, labeling him controlling. Others said we were clearly incompatible. Some tried to show empathy toward Tommy's perspective, suggesting he might simply need more information or a better understanding of the non-dogmatic nature of my practice. A few trolls went on rants about religion being a delusion, but overall, I saw a genuine attempt by many to help me figure out how to communicate with him. I intended to summarize the feedback for Tommy, but before I could, he'd found the post himself. I came home one evening to a text from him. I saw your Reddit post. I want to talk. My stomach churned. Would he be furious? Would he see all the negative labels thrown at him and lash out? But when Tommy arrived, he looked more remorseful than angry. We sat down, and he said he'd read not only my post but most of the comments too. I guess I've never really examined how I feel about religion in general, he admitted. Growing up, my dad mocked religion constantly, called it all superstitions. I started seeing it as something to be ridiculed or avoided altogether. I nodded, exhaling a bit. That explains why you're uncomfortable. But do you understand that for me it's not about rigid religion? I'm not following a strict church schedule or quoting scripture at you. It's personal. It's about memory, especially my grandmother. He nodded. I think I get that now. Reading what people wrote helped me see that it's not just black and white. Some people have altars as cultural or historical traditions, or as a form of self-expression. I'm sorry I told you to get rid of it. I felt like I was losing a sense of a purely secular home, but I realized that it doesn't threaten me or my beliefs. My eyes stung with tears of relief. You have no idea how glad I am to hear that. He touched my hand. I still consider myself an atheist, but I want to learn more about what your altar means. And maybe we can figure out a place in our eventual shared apartment that's comfortable for you to practice without me feeling like it's right in the middle of everything. I smiled through tears, nodding. Of course. I'm happy to keep it in a private corner or a spare room. I just don't want to hide it away in shame, you know? It's important to me that it's accessible. After that night, everything changed. Tommy went online, reading up on personal shrines, altars, and different cultural practices around ancestor veneration. Sometimes he'd text me an excerpt or a question. Did you know that in some cultures, altars are also used as places to journal about the day? Or, wow, I never realized how many people keep ancestor photos and candles. I, in turn, explained more about my background, how my grandmother's gentle spirituality shaped how certain saints or images reminded me of qualities I wanted to embody, like compassion, humility, courage. We continued to search for an apartment together. By then, we'd agreed that I would indeed bring my altar, and we'd find a spot. When we toured potential places, sometimes I could see a flicker of nervousness in Tommy's eyes if the space was small and open, lacking a dedicated nook. But we'd squeeze each other's hands and reassure one another we'd make it work. Eventually, we found a bright, airy apartment on a quiet street. It had a cozy living, a decent kitchen, one bedroom, and a little bonus space that could be an office or reading room. When we walked in, we both felt a sense of rightness. There was a small alcove near the front window that looked perfect for a small table or shelf, perfect for my altar. We signed the lease and started planning our move. In the weeks leading up to it, we packed our belongings. Tommy decided to donate some items he no longer needed, and I did the same. One evening, as we were sorting through boxes, he found a small stash of tea lights and turned to me. "Do these belong with your altar stuff?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Usually I keep them in the drawer to burn when I feel like reflecting or honoring someone." He handed them to me, pausing thoughtfully. "I was thinking, once we move in, would it be okay if I sometimes lit a candle too? You know, in memory of my grandpa or something?" It was such a tender gesture that I nearly burst into tears. "That would mean a lot to me, Tommy. Of course you can. It doesn't mean you believe in an afterlife or anything, but if it brings you comfort, I think that's beautiful." He nodded, managing a small smile. "Yeah, I think it might. Also, I like the soft glow it gives." Our moving day finally arrived. We lugged couches, chairs, and countless boxes. Friends came to help us. As we placed furniture in the new living room, I realized we were building our first real shared space. At one point, Tommy and a friend carried in the altar, wrapped carefully in blankets to protect its corners, and set it in the alcove. I stopped what I was doing to go over and run my fingertips across the smooth. It felt symbolic. The piece that had almost caused our breakup was now being placed lovingly in our new home. I turned to Tommy, smiling, and he gave me a quick grin back. "Looks nice there," he said softly. Once we were alone, with everyone gone, we took a moment amidst the boxes. He grabbed one of the tea lights, set it on the altar, and lit it. A gentle flame flickered. I inhaled, feeling the presence of my grandmother, and all those times I watched her do the same. I whispered a small message of thanks for the chance to share this life with Tommy, for our ability to work through conflict, for the beauty of acceptance. Tommy slipped an arm around my waist. "You know," he murmured, "I'm sorry for how I handled this. It was never about not loving you or not wanting you to have what's important. I was just ignorant and scared." "I understand," I whispered. "Thank you for learning. Thank you for trying." From that day forward, the altar was no longer a source of tension. Instead, it evolved into a quiet corner of comfort for both of us. There were still times when Tommy would say, "I don't really believe in an afterlife," but he'd light a candle anyway, letting it glow in memory of a family member or a friend. I'd see him standing there sometimes, just gazing at the flame with a contemplative look. Maybe it was soothing in a way he didn't fully articulate. Our friends would come over, notice the altar, and sometimes ask about it. I would explain, and Tommy would chime in, "She's got a cool tradition, lighting candles for her grandmother and her ancestors." If people teased him, "But aren't you an atheist?" he'd shrug and say, "I still am. It's just that I've learned a lot about how personal and meaningful altars can be. It's not about me believing in something. It's about supporting something important to the person I love." That felt like the real victory. We preserved who we both were without anyone having to forfeit their core identity. Over time, we got used to living together in a routine. Tommy had his desk set up in the bonus room where he did his coding. I set up a little art corner in the living room. The altar remained at the alcove, welcoming the occasional vase of fresh flowers or a new candle. Sometimes, if I had a particularly rough day, I'd light one in the evening and stand there quietly, letting the soft glow calm me. I noticed that Tommy would pass by, rest a hand on my shoulder, and maybe join me in silence for a moment. A few months later, we hosted a small get-together during the holiday season. His parents came. Mine were unfortunately out of town, but a handful of our mutual friends joined. As people moved around the apartment, I was curious how they'd react to the altar. But no one seemed especially put off. Tommy's dad raised an eyebrow at it briefly, but then shrugged and moved on. At one point, a friend asked me directly, "So, is that like a shrine?" I explained that it was an altar with photos of loved ones and saints, a place for me to reflect and remember. He nodded, said, "That's nice," and changed the subject. I smiled to myself, relieved that this once controversial piece of furniture had simply blended into our shared life. Over time, the conversation between Tommy and me shifted. We began discussing the concept of spiritual practice more broadly, how there could be a secular approach to certain rituals, how lighting a candle doesn't necessarily mean you believe in a deity, and how altars could serve as spaces of self-reflection or mindfulness rather than strictly religious devotion. He even joked that maybe he should build his own altar for science, with pictures of famous scientists or tokens that represented milestones in human discovery. I laughed at the idea, imagining a little corner with figurines of Albert Einstein or Marie Curie. But on a deeper level, I appreciated that he was open to the idea of symbolic spaces, recognizing that humans everywhere and throughout history have created shrines or altars to what they hold sacred, whether it's a god, an idea, or a memory. In quieter moments, he'd share how reading about altars had expanded his perspective on religion and spirituality. He still identified purely as an atheist, but he could now see that not all expressions of faith are about dogmatic preaching or insisting on the existence of the supernatural. For some, like me, it was a tapestry of ancestry, emotional comfort, and a tribute to those who came before. He mentioned, too, that the act of lighting a candle for someone he missed felt unexpectedly soothing, even if he didn't believe there was any supernatural force receiving that gesture. As we approached another milestone, our second year together, I reflected on how this obstacle could easily have torn us apart if we'd both refused to bend. If Tommy had refused to see my altar as anything but silly superstition, or if I had belittled his discomfort instead of listening, we might have parted ways. But we chose each other, and in doing so, we found a deeper intimacy, one forged by understanding each other's beliefs, or lack thereof, with compassion rather than judgment. Some nights, I'd lie in bed beside him, thinking about the earlier days when we'd first argued. The memory felt distant, like a dream. I remembered how I'd thought we were perfectly aligned until that moment. But in truth, we grew more aligned by confronting the discrepancy and working through it. It taught me the power of open communication, how essential it is to say, "This is important to me, and I need you to understand why," and to be met with, "I'll try." That vulnerability and reciprocal effort knit us closer together. One evening, I even told him, half-jokingly, that if we ever got married, I'd want my altar there. He grinned, no trace of discomfort or fear in his eyes, and said, if that day comes, I'd help carry it in myself. We laughed, feeling the weight of how far we'd come, a sign that sometimes differences can evolve into strengths in a relationship rather than fatal flaws. Of course, daily life wasn't perfect. We had our share of spats, about how to budget, about whose turn it was to do the dishes, about small, mundane matters that arise when two people share a space. But the once huge altar issue was no longer a point of friction. Instead, it symbolized that we could weather disagreement when we approached each other in good faith. After we'd been living together for about 6 months, my close friend asked me, "So, how's the whole altar situation going? You guys good?" I smiled and told her everything had worked out. She shook her head in wonder, remembering how upset I'd been at one point, and said, "It's rare to see someone actually change their stance that much. Kudos to both of you." Her words reminded me that, yes, we had both taken a leap. Tommy had to unlearn some ingrained biases. I had to open up and explain my beliefs more thoroughly than I'd ever felt the need to. It was a mutual process of bridging a gap. Sometimes I found Tommy reading quietly near the altar's glow. He'd say, "It's just a nice light to read by, that's all." But we'd exchange a small smile of understanding. We both knew it was more than just a light. It was a testament to how respect for another's heartfelt practice could bring two people closer. In moments like that, I'd recall my grandmother's words. She'd once told me that altars weren't just about religion. They were about memory, about offering a piece of your everyday life to those you wanted to honor or remember. She used to say, "We carry our loved ones inside us, but it's nice to have a place outside too, where we can see reminders of their presence." Maybe Tommy didn't believe in the afterlife or the power of saints, but he believed in supporting me. And that was enough. That was beautiful. One day, as I dusted the altar and replaced a burned-down candle, Tommy walked over with a small photo in his hand. It was a picture of his grandfather, wrinkled and worn with age. "Do you mind if I put this here?" he asked, sounding almost shy. I know it's not like my altar, but I looked at him, feeling a little wave of emotion. "Of course, put it here," I said softly. "It can be for both of us." He laid the photo down carefully. We stood there, side by side, gazing at it. Then I lit a tea light. The flame flickered, illuminating the photo's creases and capturing the warm expression of his grandfather. Tommy exhaled, as if letting go of something. Neither of us spoke for a minute, letting the quiet speak for us. It felt like a gesture of deeper unity, a way of saying, this space is for honoring your ancestors too. From that point on, the altar became not just mine, but ours in a sense. I still took the lead in caring for it, but Tommy contributed small touches. A keepsake from a college friend who had passed away. A small rock from a hike he used to take with his mother. He didn't assign the same spiritual meaning to these items that I did, yet he recognized the altar as a place to keep precious memories alive. And maybe that was enough to close the distance between atheist and believer, or between two different outlooks on life's mysteries. One evening, when I was particularly stressed about a project, Tommy found me staring at the altar, tears welling up because I missed my grandmother's comforting presence and wise words. He came up behind me, put his arms around my shoulders, and rested his chin on top of my head. We didn't say much, but he gently reached out, struck a match, and lit a candle. The flame danced in front of us. It was an unspoken reminder that I wasn't alone, that I had my grandmother's memory and I had Tommy's support. Slowly, the tension in my chest eased. I leaned back into him, grateful for the calm that settled over me. In the morning, I'd wake to see that the candle had burned down to a soft pool of wax, the first rays of sun illuminating the various pictures and mementos. And it struck me how, in a world so filled with clashes over beliefs, we managed to find harmony in our little corner of it. An altar for me, acceptance for him, and a mutual understanding that, at the end of the day, love is bigger than any label or rigid stance. Months continued to roll by. We renewed our lease, content with our shared home. Whenever new people visited, if they asked about the altar, we'd share the story, how it was once a source of conflict and how we worked through it. Often, they'd comment on how nice it smelled from the incense or how peaceful the candles looked. On occasion, someone would ask if Tommy ever felt weird about it, being an atheist. He'd grin and shake his head. She does her thing, I do mine. We respect each other. That, to me, was the essence of a lasting, healthy relationship, not forcing uniformity, but forging unity. Of course, there's always more to learn and challenges to face, but the hardest hurdle, allowing me my altar while he maintained his secular worldview, had transformed from a relationship red flag to a symbol of deeper connection. If we could manage that, I felt we could handle just about anything else. Over dinner one night, I asked Tommy, "Do you ever think about how close we came to a really big fight over that table in the corner?" He set down his fork, considering. "Yeah," he said. "Sometimes I think if I had stayed stubborn, or if you had decided it was a deal breaker to even compromise, we would have lost something really good. I'm glad we didn't." "Me too," I agreed, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "Thank you for being willing to learn." He looked away briefly, a soft flush coloring his face. "I was an ass," he mumbled. "I'm grateful you were patient enough to show me what it meant, even after I demanded you get rid of it." I shrugged. "You apologized and you did the work to understand. That means everything." We clinked our glasses of water. In that simple toast was a quiet acknowledgement of how love can expand your horizons and challenge your biases, if you let it. We were still individuals with distinct convictions. I found meaning in flickering candles, in softly murmured prayers, in the aura of memories. Tommy found meaning in science, in logic, in the tangible proof of the world around him. But we forged a bond over the acceptance that both states of being could exist under one roof without diminishing the other. He never asked me to believe less, and I never asked him to believe more. That acceptance felt like a rare gift. As the seasons changed, I replaced candles and flowers, rotating some of the items on the altar. Occasionally, I'd ask Tommy if he had anything to add or remove. Sometimes he'd remove a photo to put it in a new frame, or he'd set a small token from a recent trip. Each time it was a testament that we both contributed to this small, sacred space, even if we defined it differently. In my quieter hours, I'd reflect on how my grandmother might react, seeing an atheist's photo tokens right beside her saint candles. I like to think she'd welcome it with open arms. Ultimately, that's the real conclusion of ours. Not that one of us converted to the other's perspective, but that we chose each other, fully. Instead of letting our differences in belief tear us apart, we let them make our bond more resilient. We remain two people with distinct worldviews, choosing day after day to love and respect one another, along with everything that entails. My altar still stands in our shared home, a symbol of memory, reverence, and the power of compromise. But more importantly, it stands for a love that can hold space for both of us. And in that flame of a small candle glowing in the corner, I see the reflection of all that we've learned about patience, empathy, and the delicate weaving of lives that might otherwise have clashed. I see the warmth of possibility, the possibility that two individuals with seemingly opposing perspectives can still join hands and walk forward together. We found a way, and for that, every time I light a candle, I feel a quiet sense of gratitude that extends beyond the altar itself and into the life we share. But the story doesn't really end there, because life keeps moving, and with it, new experiences demand that we revisit old lessons. A few months after we fully settled into our apartment, Tommy received news that his dad had been hospitalized. It was nothing dire at first. Some complications with his heart, easily addressed with medication, or so the doctors assured. Yet it stirred up a new wave of feelings in Tommy. He'd always had a complicated relationship with his father's intense, anti-religious stance, but he cared about him deeply. Tommy spent a few evenings visiting his dad in the hospital, returning home subdued. One night, as he set down his keys, I noticed his eyes were red, as though he'd been crying. I walked over and wrapped my arms around him silently. He leaned his head on my shoulder, shaking slightly. "He's so stubborn," Tommy whispered. "He says he's just fine, but the doctors are worried. He refuses to follow half of their advice because he thinks it's just corporate stuff designed to make money." Tommy gave a shaky laugh. "He has a conspiracy theory for everything. I'm scared he won't listen in time." I didn't know how to comfort him other than to hold him and let him talk. When he let go, he glanced toward the altar, eyes flickering with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Do you ever light a candle for someone you're mad at or frustrated with? Or is it only for people you revere and love without conflict?" I considered the question, Sometimes I do it for people I'm worried about. Even if I'm upset or frustrated, if I want them to be safe or heal, I'll light a candle as a symbolic gesture of that hope. He stared at the altar for a moment, then quietly pulled a tea light from the drawer. I watched as he lit the match, touched it to the wick, and let the small flame catch. He set the tea light in a shallow dish, then stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest. I could see the tension in his jaw, that fear of losing his father warring with the decades of frustration over how closed-minded the man could be. I asked softly, "Does it help?" Tommy let out a breath, gazing at the tiny circle of light. "I don't know. It feels weird because I don't believe in any supernatural effect, but somehow just doing something helps me feel less powerless, I guess." I reached for his hand. "That's exactly how I feel sometimes. It's not just about supernatural beliefs. It's a ritual that grounds you, helps you process your feelings." He nodded. "Yeah, I guess that's why you always look so peaceful after lighting a candle. I used to think you believed in some big cosmic force answering your wishes. But now I see it's more about emotional clarity." That night, we sat together in the glow of that tea light, not exactly praying in the traditional sense, but silently sending well wishes to the man who had, ironically, planted the seeds of Tommy's skepticism so strongly. It was a reminder that compassion and ritual aren't confined to any one worldview. They can be something purely human, bridging the gap between belief and unbelief. In the days that followed, Tommy's dad improved slightly. He did heed some doctor's advice in the end, cutting back on certain unhealthy habits. Tommy visited him at home, helping with chores. Sometimes he came back looking relieved, other times exasperated. But each time, he seemed to settle into a reflective calm when he lit a new candle on the altar, letting the gentle ritual release some of his pent-up anxiety. I think those moments further softened Tommy's earlier hostility toward anything vaguely spiritual. He realized that while he might not believe in gods or saints, many people found solace in small, meaningful acts of ritual. And who was he to deny himself a space of reflection, especially when life's uncertainties loom? Another unexpected benefit of sharing the altar was how it deepened our emotional intimacy. Whenever we experienced a significant event, good or bad, we could mark it there. When I landed a major illustrating contract, I lit a candle in gratitude. Tommy joined, cracking a grin, saying, "I still don't believe the candle is talking to the universe, but I do believe in celebrating." When one of Tommy's old college friends passed away suddenly, we placed a photo of him on the altar for a week, lighting a candle in his memory every evening. Even some of Tommy's atheist friends who came to pay respects quietly appreciated that small gesture. It wasn't about religion. It was about having a focal point for our shared humanity, a place in the house we could go to when words failed, or tears flowed, or joy overflowed. Over time, I noticed that Tommy stopped using words like weird or superstitious. Instead, he referred to it as our corner of reflection, or occasionally as the memory table. And that was more than enough for me, recognizing it not as a threat, but as a gentle sanctuary within our home. Sometimes I thought about my grandmother, how she'd hum softly while tidying her own altar. I remembered how she used to speak about loved ones who had passed on, always with a smile on her face, as if they were still there in the room, guiding. I hoped that, in some way, she could see the path Tommy and I had walked, from conflict to understanding. I hoped she was proud of how I stood my ground yet remained open to conversation, and proud of Tommy for letting his heart expand beyond the boundaries he'd once known. Our journey taught me that altars, physical or metaphoric, are often mirrors for our innermost values. They reflect the love and respect we hold for people who are gone, the gratitude we feel for those we still have, and the hopes we nurture for our uncertain futures. Tommy's journey taught me that skepticism need not be a barrier to empathy or ritual, and that sometimes the greatest leaps in understanding come from the smallest acts of humility. Months later, as the anniversary of our move-in approached, we decided to host a celebratory dinner with close friends. Over candlelight, some on the dining table, some on the altar, we reminisced about how the year had gone. After the meal, one of our friends, Camila, who identified as agnostic, walked over to the altar and asked if she could light a candle for her mother, who was going through a rough health patch. She knew it was originally my altar, but Tommy immediately nodded, saying, "Of course, we do that all the time." I watched as she lit a candle, tears slipping down her cheeks. She whispered something under her breath, perhaps a hopeful wish for her mother's recovery. I caught Tommy's eye, and he gave me a soft smile, a silent acknowledgement of how far we'd come from that first heated argument when he demanded I get rid of this religious stuff. Now, he was offering it as a place for a friend's solace. After our guests left, Tommy and I lingered near the still burning candles on the altar. I pressed my hand to his chest, feeling his heartbeat. "You know," I said, voice hushed in the stillness of the night, "I'm so proud of us, of you, especially." He wrapped an arm around my waist. "Proud? Yes, I replied, leaning into it. Because we took what could have been a deal breaker and turned it into something that makes our bond stronger. You opened your heart. You had every reason, based on your upbringing, to reject this, but you didn't. You tried to understand. He touched his forehead to mine, closing his eyes. I'm proud of us too, he whispered. I used to think any form of spiritual practice was just silly. Now I see that sometimes it's a language people use to express things that are too deep for everyday words. We stood in silence, watching the gentle glow. In that moment, I felt an even stronger sense of unity, as though we were both guardians of a space that invited not uniformity of belief, but shared respect. It struck me as a blueprint for how people with different views could coexist in a family, in a community, maybe even on a broader scale. If we could manage it in this small corner of our home, perhaps anyone could, provided they approached each other with genuine curiosity instead of hostility. Later that night, as I got ready for bed, I passed the altar once more, noticing the flicker of almost spent candles. A wave of gratitude surged through me. Gratitude for the memories of my grandmother and her unwavering kindness. Gratitude for Tommy's willingness to grow beyond his own biases. Gratitude for the quiet, luminous acceptance that now lived in our shared home. The altar was still the same small piece of furniture with a drawer, but the meaning it held in our lives had expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined a year prior. It wasn't just about me anymore. It had become about us, our loved ones, our sorrows, our triumphs, our transitions. In that sense, I saw how an altar, or any spiritual or reflective practice, can evolve with the people who tend it. I sometimes wondered if Tommy would ever drift away from using the altar altogether once his initial curiosity faded. But even months later, he still occasionally lit a candle. Sometimes he'd murmur a name. Sometimes he'd just stare at the flame, lost in thought. He still called himself an atheist, and that never changed. But I realized that for him, it wasn't about worshiping a deity. It was a moment to slow down, to internalize gratitude, or to process a worry. I told him once that if that made him a spiritual atheist, there was no shame in it, and he just chuckled, saying he preferred not to slap a label on it. It's just me being human, he said, and that was enough for both of us. Time flowed on. Birthdays came and went. Celebrations of small milestones, random hardships, all found their place in our hearts and often manifested themselves at that altar in one way or another. If I was hurting, Tommy knew where to find me, standing near the altar, candle in hand. If he was celebrating, sometimes he'd place a new little trinket or flower next to the photos, a subtle gesture of cheer. We didn't plan it that way, but it felt natural, like we'd created a shared vocabulary of symbols. It was a testament to how an object, a simple table with candles and pictures, can serve as a bridge between two worlds if both sides are open to crossing. It helped that I never tried to force a narrative of miracles or dogmatic truth onto Tommy. And he, in turn, never mocked or scorned my desire to honor something larger than myself. Instead, we met on the common ground of love, memory, and the quiet comfort of ritual. I remember one particularly profound moment when, after a stressful week of deadlines, Tommy came up behind me while I was at the altar. I was lighting a candle for my own sense of calm, quietly inhaling the faint whiff of lavender from the wick. He gently rested his hands on my shoulders and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me this." I never knew how peaceful it could be to just stand still and let a small flame symbolize whatever's on my mind. We stayed there, together, eyes on the flame, hearts aligned in the hush. It felt like we were each supporting the other's existence, bridging all the differences that had once threatened to tear us apart. And I realized then that this was the hallmark of true partnership, not uniformity in belief, but unity in spirit. So the altar stayed, and so did Tommy's atheism. And so did our love. And each time I dusted the table or replaced an old candle, each time Tommy found a new photograph or token to place beside the saints and ancestors, I felt the echo of my grandmother's presence, as though she were nodding in approval. In my childhood, she had taught me that altars are living spaces for growth, for memory, for connection, places where you lay down your heart, your fears, your joys. Now I saw that I was living her lesson in an even broader sense, letting my altar be a place where two very different perspectives on life could intertwine in harmony. That's how I came to understand the deeper magic of altars. They aren't just stands for candles or pictures. They're arenas where we wrestle with our hopes and anxieties, shrines to the intangible. They're quiet corners where love can speak more loudly than dogma, where memory can outshine fear, and where acceptance stands guard against the walls that might otherwise separate us. In learning to share that space with Tommy, I saw that even the firmest beliefs, like my grandmother's gentle faith or Tommy's staunch atheism, could coexist if nurtured by respect. One day, Tommy asked if I could paint a small picture to place on the altar. I was taken aback. "Paint what?" He shrugged, a little bashful. "I don't know. Something that represents us both. Maybe it's an abstract swirl, or something that blends science and spirituality. Just a personal piece that says, We share this corner of our life. Overwhelmed with a warm flush of emotion, I agree. For the next few weeks in between my commissioned projects, I worked on a small canvas. I combined faint star maps, a nod to Tommy's love of astronomy and science, with gentle, wispy shapes reminiscent of candle smoke. It was subtle, with swirling colors that hinted at a cosmic dance. When it was done, I placed it in a simple wooden frame and set it on the altar. Tommy stood there, arms crossed, staring at it for a long while. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It's perfect." Now that painting rests among the photos of grandparents, the saint candles, the tokens of travel, the tea lights, and the small stack of books I keep about spiritual traditions. In one glance, you can see the tapestry of our home, how it's woven from various threads that might have clashed if we hadn't taken the time to weave them mindfully. So whenever someone asks, how can an atheist and a spiritual person truly share a home? I think of that painting on the altar, the swirl of star maps and candle smoke, and I smile. The answer is simple, yet profound. You share it by offering each other room to exist fully. No erasures, no forced conversions. You meet in that quiet space where you realize that love, memory, and understanding are bigger than any label. That is, in the end, the story of how a small altar in a modest apartment came to reflect the best parts of our hearts, a place of dialogue, respect, and union. And even as life takes us through more challenges, that altar remains, always ready to gather our joys and our sorrows alike, standing as a reminder that true harmony doesn't demand sameness. It only needs willingness, empathy, and the gentle courage to let the flame of understanding burn bright, lighting up both the shadows of doubt and the bonds of togetherness.